first one is documentary sources of writing African history, and then the second one is non-documentary sources of writing African history. So he said that, George, see, it is almost lunch and I am hungry, so I can only give you the explanations for the documentary sources of writing African history. So by that time, I was curious. I wanted to know more about that particular question. So I said, sir, you can go ahead. So he said that the documentary sources are the written sources, whether in ink or in inscription, whether in ink and in inscription on surfaces such as papers and stone wall, on surfaces such as ceramics, on surfaces such as a certain paper called papyrus. That paper is from, you see, when we get to the civilization of ancient Egypt, I'll give you explanation of that particular word, papyrus. You see, so in the past, Africans and then travelers of Africa, those that visited Africa in the past, were able to write down certain information about Africa, which today we can use as documentary sources of writing African history. So he went further to give me two major types of studying. He went further to give me two major types of the documentary sources which I'm talking about. And he said that the two major types of documentary sources are primary and secondary sources. So he started by giving me the explanation of primary sources. So he said that primary sources are the sources that were created during the time of an event in the past. In other words, he also said that primary sources are the sources that are contemporaneous, that were created contemporaneous to a certain event in the history of a certain country. So in this case, we are talking about the history of Africa. So the sources that were created contemporaneous to a certain event in the history of Africa, those are the primary sources. See, he started giving me some examples. When you go to the history of Ghana from the 1930s down to 1940s to the 1948, there was a certain event called the 1948 riot. Now, that event occurred in the streets of Accra. Some ex-servicemen who were very angry at the colonial government because the colonial government failed to give them the stipend that was promised to be given to them after they returned from the Second World War. So as a result of that, these ex-servicemen decided to demonstrate their anger to the colonial government. But the colonial government, when they got to the castle to submit their petition to the government, the policemen at the castle saw that action as rude, as threatening to them. Meanwhile, these ex-servicemen were unarmed. They were just demonstrating. So they started to shoot at them. And that resulted in the death of 3 important ex-servicemen in the history of Ghana. So after narrating this story, he said that during that time when the 1948 riot occurred, there was a certain newspaper called the Evening Newspaper. As at that time, it has been established, and then that newspaper captured that story. So you see, that newspaper documented all that happened back in that time. So if a historian is looking for traces of nationalism, if a historian is looking for nationalistic attitude of Ghanaians in the past, he can just take that particular primary document, put them into important analysis, and present them to the to his fellow actual historians and the apprentice historian for further studies. You see, so that is what primary sources are about. See, when these primary sources are subjected to intelligent interpretations, after the findings has been gathered, has been written down by this historian, he would then present to the apprentice historians as the secondary source document. So there is a certain secondary source document called Evolution and Change. Now, this book talks about how Ghana's politics existed. It traces Ghana's politics from 1950s to 1960s down to 1980s. And that particular secondary source document was created by a certain man called Professor Dubuahi in the history of Ghana. So you see, after these primary sources had been gathered and subjected into intelligent interpretations, they now evolved into becoming secondary sources of writing African history. So these are the two types of the documentary sources: primary sources and the secondary sources. So at this point in time, my teacher was somehow tired and it was getting to lunch. So he said that, George, Charlie, my brother, go back and come back another time so that we can discuss the non-documentary sources of writing African history. So this will be the end of today's video. In the next video, we are going to talk about how our conversation ended with respect to the non-documentary sources of writing African history. So if what I am doing right now, you are interested, you like my style of teaching, please don't leave without subscribing, because the more you subscribe, the more the algorithm of YouTube will see that yes, my content are important for the public and the public must benefit from them. So please subscribe and like this video so that it will be recommended to other people who are interested in the study of history as a subject. In our next video, we will discuss the non-documentary sources, and then we move further to the prehistory of Africa. Now, even before that, I will make sure I take you through the periodization in history. I am going to take you through the periodization in history. So, because a periodization in history, historians afaso acheche emre ene nnem a omode hwe so twere Africa bakwasem. There were certain period in Ghana's history that if you can see in my first video that I did, there was a certain period in Ghana's history that refers to the independence history of Ghana. There is a certain period in Ghana's history that is called the colonial history of Ghana. In fact, there is a certain topic that talks about the colonial history of Africa. So you see, history has been gathered into periods. So in my next video, we will talk about periodization in African history, and then after that, we will move on to talk about the African prehistory. Then we continue to the civilization of ancient Egypt. So expect more from the Hoselaman teacher. Yes, I mean yes, we pescato camera, we pescato ring light. We pescadi a near my baby. It is a one age mother children who they are, and your brother Tommy Kinton Bina, the business name, my crowd.